Right, let's go across to where all the live action is. Prime Minister Narendra Modi arriving at the International Media Centre from Bharat Mandapam. The Prime Minister expected to address the nation as well after a successful run at the G20 presidency. Of course, historic day for India, historic 2 days for India indeed, given the fact that India was able to get the New Delhi Declaration adopted and really emerging as a voice of the global south in all the initiatives that it has championed, not just in the past 2 days, but indeed in the past 10 months as the president of the G20. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi there arriving at the International Media Centre.
And it's rather interesting, you know, I've covered international summits, Vedant, for a Prime Minister of a host nation to arrive at International Media Centre and wave at the media crowd which has gathered. It also shows the confidence. Here is the man who has clearly won and because of his diplomatic dexterity. Nobody gave India a chance. But Prime Minister Narendra Modi was confident that a Delhi declaration is possible, and he ensured it. For him, it was also about his personal personal charisma which was at stake. He understands fully well that in the next few months, India will be seeing the general elections, but before that, there are 5 states that are going to polls. There's lots at stake for him personally. And that is the reason why this is a victory march for the Prime Minister. He understands fully well that there is a section of the international press which may not report even this diplomatic success, a milestone for India, and look at it from a completely different prism. He is sending a message that this is his victory lap, and he has come here to celebrate with the people of media that has gathered from all over the world.
Security, security. Security. No. Sir. Sir. हो गया. No.
So, Mara, you were making an interesting point that this, in a sense, is the Prime Minister's victory march. In a sense, in India vindicated, given the fact that you said that nobody gave India a chance, but India really has emerged as a successful president of the G20, championing causes for a better planet. Of course, various initiatives, including climate change, on the focus. But coming back to that point of India's messaging and the Prime Minister's messaging, whether it was his personal touch of meeting all the leaders, welcoming leaders personally, it also has a lot of ramifications domestically, as far as domestic politics is concerned.
Yes, and for domestic audience, this is India's place of pride. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi, for his constituency, has placed India on such a pedestal that India is taken seriously, that Indians matter. You know, Vedant, if I were to compare the G20 Summit that I covered in Brisbane in 2014 to covering the G7 Summit, where India was an invitee nation just few months back in Hiroshima, the India story, because of brand Narendra Modi and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has generated a lot of interest. There's a lot of curiosity about this man who is leading a democracy as vibrant as ours, and someone who has navigated the most tricky diplomatic space to come up with a document such as this, a New Delhi Declaration, with 100% consensus. Who would have thought that in the most challenging times that we are living in the times of war, on one hand you have Russia, on the other the complete Western world, both seem to be happy with the Delhi Declaration.
Absolutely, Mara. And as you said, it's a time of shifting power dynamics globally, globally tumultuous time, of course, as you mentioned. But coming back to that point of how it matters domestically, for the first time, we are seeing that G20 actually matters to an average voter. As I've been saying, it no longer is confined to Delhi corridors or the Hyderabad house. It actually matters to an average voter. In fact, we can see the Prime Minister now actually leaving the International Media Centre after, but a rare visual indeed, Marja, isn't it?
Because yes, absolutely. You know, I'm saying again and again, Vedanta, I've covered enough and more international summits. And I've never seen Prime Minister of any country, President of any country, come to the International Media Center and just wave to the gathered media. This is indeed Prime Minister Narendra Modi sending a message to the international press that whatever you may say, I have had my share of victory. And it is India's moment to shine. That this is India's moment, sending a message of India's global dominance. That an emerging nation understands the challenges of developing nations such as African Union. India is the voice of the global south, but it is also part of the most powerful groupings, be it the Quad, and also Prime Minister Narendra Modi's presidency of G20 has meant that India has redefined the very institution of G20. How there are several decisions which have been taken on the sidelines, Vedant, be it the rail corridor, shipping corridor, and also the biofuel alliances. These are very, very futuristic in nature. So Prime Minister here just waving to the media and then exiting.
So in a sense, the Prime Minister showcasing the fact that India has really evolved what the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar also calls the India way, whether it is international institutions, how India has to be at the center stage of global diplomatic institutions, and not just India. India has talked about global good and the interests of developing nations and the voice of the global south, as Mara just mentioned, the Prime Minister there, and as Mara put it, his victory march. All right. So, Amara, as we were discussing the International Media Centre itself, of course, Bharat Mandapam, in a sense, the government's bid to showcase Bharat to the world. But the International Media Centre, a state-of-the-art media centre with over 1,300 workstations. As you mentioned, you've covered so many international summits. But as we've been saying, India's G20 presidency has been an outlier, a diplomatic outlier, whether it's in terms of the numbers, whether it's in terms of the number of outcomes in that New Delhi declaration. How do you see, given the fact that you've covered so many, whether it's the G7 or the G20 summits earlier, how do you see India's G20 presidency as an outlier?
Yes, in many ways. A developing nation understanding what it is for African continent to not be represented properly in these groupings, to not get a place of which they deserve. Prime Minister Narendra Modi emerging as the voice of the global south. He is particularly paying attention to what is being seen as energy-rich African nations, but also understanding that these nations have multiple challenges, particularly to do with, multi-development banks, not giving them finances the way it should be. So that is one aspect of it. The fact that under him, in the last 6 years, we have seen a complete transformation of India's digital public infrastructure, Vedant. And that is now a template which will be followed by the world. So I think, yes, Vishnu is there. Let's go across to Vishnu. Please go ahead, Vishnu.
Hi, Maria. How are you? Well, I can certainly tell you that it's been quite the show over here. A little while back, we've seen Prime Minister Modi come in over here. There would be, upwards of 1,000 journalists quite easily. He sort of came in over here. He greeted journalists. There was a sitting area. He didn't sit down as some would have hoped. There were cheers for the Prime Minister as well as he went around this entire room and left. But I think what he also did come to see was this gigantic International Media Centre where we've been reporting from over the last 3 odd days. I've never seen anything like it. And what you can see on your screens right now is just one part of it. There is actually an identical floor, one floor above or 2 floors above, which is also the International Media Centre. It's identical in all respects. So it is absolutely huge in terms of the facilities and something which India has been trying to promote as well. Be that as it may, Maria, as you know, it's been a very substantive G20 with a lot which has actually been done. I think to a lot of the officers who've actually been dealing with it, and I've been speaking to them through the day, it's all sort of seeping in slowly that they've actually managed to get that Delhi declaration done with unanimity at so many levels, pretty much all levels. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been done. Maria.
Absolutely, Vishnu, and it's been a tiring few days for you as well. But as you just mentioned, I mean, you've been covering diplomacy really for the past 3 decades. But this was really India's big global breakout moment, and that was really at play, particularly in the past 3 days. So how do you see this?
No, you're right.
Go ahead.
No, Maria, you're absolutely right about this. In fact, I spoke to Harsh Shringla, the chief coordinator for G20 about this, and I asked him whether this was a breakout moment, whether this sort of reflects where Indian foreign policy now stands at a global level. And my question to him, or my belief, and he agreed with me, was that we are, now the 5th largest economy in the world. We'll become the 3rd largest economy in the world. And with our economic growth, there has been a greater diplomatic presence of India at all fora. But by having a G20, done in this manner, very difficult language which had to be negotiated, very difficult themes which had to be negotiated, was a showcase of Indian diplomacy. Now, if you talk about the Indian Foreign Service, it's actually among the smallest foreign services for a country which is as large as ours. A couple of years back, it was actually smaller than the Foreign Service of Singapore. It's grown a little bit now. But for the Indian Foreign Service to be able to pull off something as large as this showcases the talent of a lot of young and middle-level officers who are the actual foot soldiers. And again, this was something that Amitabh Kant told us yesterday when I spoke to him, and Harsh Shringla repeated today, that it was these officers who waded into some of the toughest negotiations, particularly on the issue of whether the name Russia will be mentioned or not in the G20 declaration, and then went to country after country after country with draft after draft after draft, more than 200 meetings, before finally when last night, or I beg your pardon, day before last night, that they finally figured out that they could actually get this done. And I think it is also interesting when I was at the press conference of the French President Emmanuel Macron, where Mr. Macron actually said that, look, it's not a climb down, there is criticism of Russia, we clearly don't want this to be an era of war. Be that as it may, this venue, the G20 venue, isn't the proper venue to be addressing just geostrategic issues linked with one war. Ultimately, this is an economic grouping, and it's a grouping which needs to deal with climate issues linked to the environment, financial inclusion issues, broader trade issues, multi-development banks, you name it. So the focus is now, as a result of India's efforts, and this has been accepted by all of these countries, back on what G20 is actually meant to be doing. Isn't to suggest at all that Ukraine is not significant, that it doesn't have a bearing. It does, which is why it got into the G20 as a conversation in the first place. But the point that India has been making, and other countries now agree, is that, look, there is a lot more. And that is where Indian diplomacy has succeeded in actually pushing through G20 for the benefit of billions around the world, not just being stuck on one issue. It's required remarkable negotiations, a remarkable process, and a great deal of tenacity. It's not one nation you're convincing, it's so many. And I think so, therefore, to answer your question in one sentence, yes, this is one of the finest moments in Indian diplomacy, and I think Indian diplomacy has come of age at a new level that we've not seen before.
All right, so Vishnu there reporting from the Bharat Mandapam. And Vishnu, very quickly before I let you go, if you could also tell me, in the past 3 days of reporting on the Heads of State Summit, if I had to pin you down and ask you to tell me the 3 big takeaways, not just from the New Delhi declaration, but from India's G20 presidency, from this big global breakout moment that we're just discussing.
Well, breakout moment number 1, getting a consensus on language as far as the Ukraine issue is concerned. Number 2, being the voice of the global South in getting Africa into the African Union into the G20 as a permanent member. And number 3, making this an entirely national affair. This is not, a G20 event which is restricted to New Delhi and the Mandapam. From Kashmir to Lakshadweep, you've had meetings all over. So this is an all-India effort, an all-government effort, and I think the government genuinely needs to be praised for this achievement. It's not been easy at all.
quickly. And, one last question, as you were also mentioning, this is for the first time that we are seeing that the G20 actually matters to an average voter. And it's not just confined to the corridors of Delhi or perhaps Hyderabad House. So, India's bid has been to make it like a festival, something that an average voter actually cares about. How strong has that messaging been?
That's a really tough question, Vedant. And it's difficult to get into political calculus attached with G20. Be that as it may, it is correct to say that if you sort of put this in as one of the items that the government has been trying to push, or the BJP has been trying to push ahead of the elections next year, then it's a gamble that they've taken, because foreign policy doesn't necessarily translate into votes. But what they are trying to do is suggest that this is a part of the India story. This is a part of their achievements. When they talk about digitalization, that is an achievement. When they talk about GDP growth, that is an achievement. When they talk about diplomacy, which includes all of this, that is an achievement. And they therefore want to take all of this to the voter and say, we have enhanced the prestige of the nation internationally. This is what we've done for India at a larger stage, and therefore here we are coming to you for votes. Now, whether that translates into votes or not needs to be seen, because people do tend to vote on lower issues, on smaller issues, on issues which affect them more directly, Bijli Sadak Pani issues. But it is a play, certainly. And certainly in terms of what we've seen in the run-up, still a ways away for the election. But this is a big achievement one way or the other.
Vishnu, thanks so much for joining us with all those details, and of course that relentless reporting there from Bharat Mandapam. Well, India's big global breakout moment there, as we've been discussing, the Prime Minister's victory march there as that Heads of State Summit comes to an end. We'll take a short break now. News and updates continue on the other side.